Hey Push, today we're going to focus on the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War, and we are also going to get into how the U.S. built an empire and look a little bit at our role in Asia as well. So, just to reflect a bit, I know we've probably already talked about this in class, and you've read it, of course, in Chapter 27, but the causes of the Spanish-American War are pretty complex, right? And I think what we see is that this was a time when the Americans were looking for a war. And this is why John Hay is going to call it a splendid little war. I think the United States is looking to exert their muscles a little bit and get an empire. Because as we know, we were a little late to the colonization party, right? That most of Europe had already colonized Africa, parts of Asia. So the United States, by this point, by 1898, is really looking to build an empire, and the Spanish-American War gives us that excuse. So think about what the causes are. We're going to have a nice discussion in class about what do you blame the most for the Spanish-American War and why. Think about how we can incorporate some of those documents into that discussion. So we know that the way the Spaniards were treating the Cubans was pretty horrible. So Jose Marti, this guy right here, is writing and publishing and trying to get Americans to really understand, really comparing the plight of the Cubans to our struggle against Britain before the American Revolution. We also know yellow journalism is really playing this up, and we've got kind of these dueling newspapers. We've got Pulitzer and Hearst going back and forth trying to sell papers. And so think about the role that's going to play. We've got Ambassador de Lome, who's talking smack about McKinley. We've got the explosion of the Maine. That's going to be a really big event, and ultimately we're going to see that that is probably one of the main reasons why we actually do go to war. Whether or not you want to hold it responsible for the blame is up to you. So before we get into the results, new territories, Cuba's independence, and the Philippines is a whole other conversation. I'm going to say at this point, you should pause, and we should have a little discussion about who is to blame for the Spanish-American War. Who do you want to hold the most accountable for this war, and why? And I want to hear, I want to see that evidence from the documents. I want you pulling quotes, okay? This is great DBQ practice. So at this point, go ahead and pause. We're going to have maybe 6 areas set up in the classroom. One for McKinley, one for de Lome, one for the Maine, one for the journalists, one for economic reasons, and one for social Darwinism. And whichever one you think is the most to blame, I want you to head to that spot, and I want you to find at least 2 or 3 pieces of specific evidence from those documents and or from Chapter 27, all right? Pause, have a conversation. We'll come back, and I want to compare what the classes have said about this. All right, I'm sure that was absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear what we talked about and what you guys are going to blame the Spanish-American War on. So let's start talking about the results. Okay, what are the results of the Spanish-American War? Well, we get our empire, don't we? Right? We get Puerto Rico. Don't take Cuba, but we're going to see we definitely have a lot of influence over Cuba. We do annex Guam and the Philippines as well. And so we get that empire, and Philippines is going to be a whole conversation that now we're going to have to define our foreign policy. And so a lot of the questions here are going to be, wait a second, do the territories that we now own, does the Constitution apply to those people there? Okay, so we're going to hear the anti-imperialist movement is really almost a double-edged sword. On one hand, we have some people who are saying, hey, we shouldn't take an empire because it goes against our country's history, right, and what we stand for. We're going to have another nasty side of the anti-imperialist movement who are going to say things like, hey, we shouldn't take an empire because those people don't deserve our democracy or they're not as good as us. Okay, so we want to recognize both sides of that coin. Power of the U.S. presidency is definitely going to expand over this. We're going to see that, and now we're jumping in, right, to the world power, meaning we're going to have more rivalries. We're going to have other countries starting to see us as a threat. And the ethical conflict I talk about is this whole idea of, is this who we are? The anti-imperialists, and some of them are really going to say that, no man is good enough to gather another man without that other's consent. Look who they're quoting there, Abraham Lincoln. They're going to say what we're doing here goes against our founding principles. That is definitely part of the anti-imperialist movement, but it's also not all of the anti-imperialists. Buffalo Soldiers, this is really kind of a cool thing. So the African Americans that fought in the Spanish-American War, because remember, they were, of course, fighting everywhere. They were on the plains in the Indian Wars. They're here, but they're fighting in segregated troops. And the Native Americans, actually on the plains, nicknamed them Buffalo Soldiers because of their hair. They said their hair reminded them of the buffalo mane. And so the song you've probably heard, the Bob Marley song, is all about the Spanish-American War. And if you don't believe me, look at the lyrics, you guys. They're talking about San Juan. They're talking about the Caribbean. They're talking about fighting. You'll see. And so he's trying to highlight that. Fun fact, next time you hear that song playing at your summer party. All right. U.S. in Latin America. Here's where we're going to bring up some of the things we learned before, like that Monroe Doctrine. Do you remember what that was? It's been a while. What did that Monroe Doctrine do? Okay, what it does is this is when James Monroe, 5th president, says, hey, Europe, stay out of our hemisphere. And remember, it looked like it worked because the Europeans don't come back over and recolonize Latin America after the Spanish Empire falls apart, after Simón Bolívar does his thing. It's really more probably the Europeans had more on their plate with the revolutions of 1832, 1848, right? But it looked like they listened to us. So what we're going to see is after 1898, especially when Teddy Roosevelt is president, we're going to get something called the Roosevelt Corollary added on to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary is something you add on. So what does this mean? It means not only Europe stay out of our hemisphere, but we will be the ones in charge of policing this hemisphere. And so he actually does this to kind of protect the Dominican Republic, who are about to default on their loans. And the fear was that some European countries might come in and try to collect and try to, send over fleets of warships. And so Roosevelt basically says, hey, you can't do that. But by the way, we can. Okay, we will enforce law and order. So many Latin American nations are kind of like, thanks, right? Like they're not really sure, just kind of like they were with Monroe Doctrine. We're like, okay, we appreciate that you told them to stay out. We're not so sure how we feel about you saying you can get involved, So this is going to start a lot of kind of resentment that we're going to see build in our U.S. policy towards Latin America, especially with Cuba, especially with Mexico. We're going to see that's going to come up a lot. And I would argue we're still dealing with the after effects of that even right now, you guys. So it goes back to this moment, okay? So make sure you understand what that Roosevelt Corollary is, how it adds on to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so let's talk about where this corollary gets a little sticky, okay, and how applying it is going to, in some cases, lead to some resentment and some issues. Let's start off with Cuba. So during the Spanish-American War, you learned in Chapter 27 that the Teller Amendment was basically kind of pushed through, which says the U.S. has no claim over Cuba, basically saying we had no intent to take over Cuba when the war was over. We were helping Cuba be liberated from Spain, and that was the point. Okay, now, after the war, we're going to see the pressure's on. A lot of people start to go, ooh, wait a second. Look at how valuable Cuba is. Look at how close it is to the United States. And we're going to show you some political cartoons that even demonstrate some of this. So what we're going to see is the Platt Amendment will be added as policy, which essentially says that Cuba's constitution cannot be changed without permission of the United States. Also grants us a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which we still have, by the way. So, the Cuban people are kind of like, hold on, we thought we were going to be totally free, totally independent. Do we ever annex Cuba? No. But you could argue that the United States is definitely exerting a lot of control over the Cuban government, and that, you guys, is going to lead to some resentment, okay? Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is another case where we're going to get this territory as part of the Spanish-American War, and we'll see the Foraker Act, which makes Puerto Rico a protectorate. So it is not a state, right? And you guys know that. But originally the Foraker Act did not grant you Puerto Rican citizenship. However, by 1917, Puerto Ricans will be U.S. citizens, as they are today. Okay, so that's an issue that has come up more recently, especially in light of Hurricane Maria. I think a lot of people in the United States aren't aware that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And I got a great story for that I'll have to tell you about my friend's dad and the Social Security office. So I will talk to you about that in class. The insular cases. So this is a series of Supreme Court cases that gets known as the insular cases. And what essentially is ruled in these cases is, like when we take over a place, right? When we take over Puerto Rico or Guam or later on the Philippines, does that mean all the people there have the guarantee of the Bill of Rights and due process like people here do? And so what the Supreme Court essentially rules in the insular cases is no. The Constitution does not always follow the flag, okay? So this is sort of a convenient way to not have to uphold rights in the places that we have built into our empire. So the other thing we're going to see is there's going to be this desire. I mean, there had been, right? Since the mid-1800s, we've been talking about building some kind of a canal. And so there were different places. You guys already know Nicaragua was proposed. It's a longer distance, but it would have been an easier build. But Panama is a shorter distance. Fun fact, the Panama Canal actually goes from west to east, believe it or not. If you look on a map, you'll see what I'm saying. Doesn't go the way you think it would go. But at this point, it's controlled by Colombia. Okay, so Colombia already told the United States, nope, sorry, we're not selling anything to you. So here's where Teddy Roosevelt's going to get creative. He's going to help the Panamanians. Yeah, that's a word. It's a fun word to say. He's going to encourage them to rise up against Colombia. And Roosevelt will say, look, we'll back you up. Okay, so if you do that, we'll back you up. All we ask is, you give us the rights to the canal. So that is exactly what happens. And that's how we get the rights to build the canal, which will take many years. And it's definitely not easy, but that is how the canal was essentially kind of constructed. Okay? Now, we're going to see that Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, where he talks about speaking softly and carrying a big stick. We're going to discuss this in class, and I'll give you some examples of that. William Howard Taft, the next president, is going to have what he calls dollar diplomacy. And this is going to be a way to sort of smooth things out, especially in the Philippines. Okay, the Filipinos were none too pleased about the United States coming in and essentially telling them that they were going to get their freedom from Spain. And then when the war was all over, not giving it them. In fact, we annexed the Philippines. So the Philippines will be a U.S. colony until 1946. Significance of that? Oh, hey, it's the year after we defeat Japan in World War II, right? So we're going to hold on to the Philippines until Japan is no longer a threat. This guy, Emilio Aguinaldo, who fought originally with us against Spain, will lead the resistance against us. We will lose 5,000 Americans fighting in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, which is way more than we lose in the Spanish-American War. So it is very difficult. And this is going to be another thing that the anti-imperialists are going to point to and say, who have we become? Right? Look at what's happening here. Look at our morals of what this country was founded on. So make sure you understand that complicated relationship with the Philippines and how that definitely raises some issues. So dollar diplomacy is this way that Taft was actually the first governor of the Philippines. So he had, he definitely was interested in that area. He had spent time out there, and he thought, hey, if we use our good stuff, our schools, our roads, our infrastructure, and we help invest in the Philippines, then they will be grateful, and that will smooth out our relationship. That's kind of the idea of dollar diplomacy. Okay, so that's his idea of way to sort of smooth out the relationship a little bit. Let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to look at what's happening in the Far East. So I want to talk about China and Japan. Again, some of this you learned last year, but we already know that China was decimated by the Opium Wars, and most favored nation status was given, which essentially divided up China into spheres of influence. Okay, so these are the countries that pretty much divvied up China and forced the people there to trade only with them. So think about, again, we talked about resentment in that policy. So I want you to understand that those people were not happy to be, really taken advantage of an unfair trade agreement. So this leads to the Boxer Rebellion. Excuse me. Open door policy is the U.S.'s attempt to try to kind of say, hey, everyone should trade equally here, which is still resented by the Chinese because the Chinese wanted their country for themselves. But this is another policy by John Hay trying to get us a foot in the door since we had sort of missed out on this. And this resentment is really going to lead to some more upheaval in China that will kind of hit a peak in 1911 when Sun Yat-sen takes over. And then we're going to see, as you know, that China is still going to struggle between those who want to work with the West and those who want to reject it. And that will take us really to Mao Zedong, and we get to that revolution. Okay? So understand the role the open door policy plays here in getting the United States a foot into China. And then last but not least, we want to talk about Japan. And again, we know that we had interest in Japan as early as 1853. We learned that. We know that Japan is going under rapid industrialization. And they're starting to already show aggression, okay? You guys know where this is heading, right? What we are going to see now is the U.S. taking an active role, Teddy Roosevelt right there, mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, okay? The Treaty of Portsmouth is going to do that. but it's going to leave bitterness with that gentleman's agreement. A lot of the Japanese were frustrated because their people were being discriminated against in California and San Francisco. And so Roosevelt will put an end to the discrimination, but in exchange, he says, you can't send us any more people. So that's going to lead to more resentment. So think about how these policies lead to resentment, you guys, as we go through these topics and as you read Chapter 27.